Hey, here we are one more time uh, in my dining room, trying to figure out how to explain Fourth Amendment issues to you, and in the day and time of coronavirus and lockdowns. So here we go. Remember that the Fourth Amendment is your privacy rights. Uh, However, we are going through a number of ideas about how that is changed or is restricted. We talked about how privacy is really not in the Constitution in the Fourth Amendment. We've got this right to be secure in our persons, our house, our papers, and our effects. That security is against unreasonable searches and seizures, which of course implies that there's going to be reasonable searches and seizures that do not violate the Fourth Amendment. And we kind of spent the last two videos talking about those kinds of ideas. What equals a reasonable search for those things? The second half of the Fourth Amendment deals with warrants, which is another built-in restriction to your rights. In this case, essentially a warrant gives the government, the police, the ability to violate this feeling of security, as long as they've got probable cause. We've talked about what that means, and some specifics about where and when to be searched. Although we did talk about how this concept of the place to be searched and things to be searched for, based on the good faith exception, sometimes even that is a little loose. So, moving on. Here's our list of exceptions. We've talked about most of these in depth at this point. Stop and frisk for the safety of the officer can be used to find more evidence if it comes up in the course of a legal stop and frisk. A lot of people believe that has been taken too far, that basically made up reasons to stop somebody and then frisk them just to see if you can find something. Other people claim that that's part of good police work. We hear a lot of debate about that right now in the news. Talk about hot pursuit and the notion that it seems reasonable. Remember, all these things are things that are reasonable without warrant. It seems reasonable to allow the police to chase a suspect through places without a warrant. Seems reasonable that if you tell the government that you can look there, then don't be surprised when they do. It's not a violation of privacy. You let them. This goes back to the Fourth Amendment being a personal right. If the police need to stop a crime from occurring, exigent circumstances, urgent circumstances, don't have to get a warrant to bust into some place and stop a school shooting, for example. Automobile exception, the idea that if the evidence may disappear, I think I told a story about a guy who had blood underneath his fingernails. If the evidence is going to disappear, then maybe it's reasonable we let the police search without warrant. You can come up with a couple, though, kind of scary scenarios where police can look into some things, or the government can look into some things because they can claim that it's capable of disappearing, and those are the kinds of things that we deal with in the courts. But basically, the automobile exception, if the evidence can disappear, then it seems reasonable to let us search without warrant. Plain view, very simple. If it's out in the open and the officer can see it when he's legal to be there, then it's not a problem. And finally, good faith. Talked about that already today in this video. The idea that if everybody did everything they could to protect your rights by going through the process of getting probable cause, getting a warrant, and then a mistake was made, two numbers were flipped or something like that, we're going to let that happen because it was a mistake. But everybody did what they were supposed to do in order to protect your privacy. But this leads to a couple interesting questions about what exactly is your privacy. Now, in class, we talked a bit about this when we watched that video from Frontline about artificial intelligence. And the idea that, just because you're in public doesn't mean that you don't have privacy. And that this court case, Katz versus United States, is going to be extremely important today to trying to help us understand where do we have privacy and where don't we. So real quickly, the Katz case involves a man who was placing bets at a phone booth back in the day when there were phone booths, and the FBI put a listening device in the speaker handle and to kind of collect some evidence. They asked the phone company if they could do this. The phone company was fine. The phone company owned the phone, so therefore the FBI figured they were fine. But when Mr. Katz was in fact arrested for evidence after evidence was collected, Mr. Katz suggested that, wait a second, regardless of who owns the phone booth, I own the conversation. And I was in a position where I was being private. I had privacy of my person, privacy of my place, maybe. And that you should have gotten a warrant, and you didn't. And because you had no warrant, therefore, any evidence collected would be part of that poison tree, fruit of the poison tree. And therefore, I should not be convicted. The Supreme Court agreed with Mr. Katz on this. It essentially said, look, Mr. Katz went through a lot of steps that made it appear as if he believed he was private. He had a door on the phone booth, which he closed. He, was speaking in a small room. It wasn't like there was anybody else around. And therefore, he was being private, regardless of whether or not he was actually being private. And so with this, we create the reasonable expectation of privacy concept, which essentially says that you have a reasonable, there's that word again, that's very difficult because it means whatever it is that the user wants it to mean. So how do we determine what is reasonable? Well, in this case, we're going to decide, a 12-person jury is who gets to decide. 12 people on a jury decide what by community standards is a reasonable, and in this case, a reasonable expectation of privacy. Mr. Katz expected to be private. Let me give you a better example, one maybe you can understand from your personal life. So imagine you're in school and you're in the cafeteria and you scream across the cafeteria to your friend. It's like, hey, Joe, you want to, go smoke some crack? Well, if you do that and somebody overhears you, which everybody's going to, then you're going to get in trouble. The idea is that you were in public, you screamed something, everybody heard it. It was kind of plain view, if you think about the plain view exception. And so therefore, no one's going to think that you expected any privacy. But if you're in the cafeteria and there's hundreds of people around you, and you whisper in your friend's ear something, and I, am standing right behind you, and my ear is like right down in your, by your mouth, and I hear you, well, then it's like kind of like I'm the one that's got the problem because I'm the one that was violating your reasonable expectation of privacy. You were in a big group, that's true, but because of your actions, you showed that you were expecting to be private even though you're in public. Mr. Katz was in public, but he had the door closed. He was talking on a telephone, and that gives him a reasonable expectation of privacy. Now, how does this all impact us today? Well, we got these things, and these things, are kind of public, kind of private. We all know that everything that's on these things is, looked at, collected, the data's, examined. So is what's on there mine? I expected it to be private, or is it somebody else's? And in this case, I don't know. We can get into debates about, well, you don't really expect it to be private, do you? I mean, come on, everybody knows it's being collected. But, but still, it's my phone, right? I don't let people see it, and therefore it's, without my permission. So therefore, it's still, I do expect privacy. So the case that helps us understand this is going to be one involving telephone companies back in the 1970s, Smith versus Maryland, in which essentially the law enforcement wanted to collect information about phone records, and the state of Maryland, was trying to collect the information, and Mr. Smith was saying, no, this is my information. I own the conversation. This is my privacy. I expected privacy. I was at my own house calling. Nobody else was there. It's my phone. Isn't that privacy? And in this case, the Supreme Court agreed kind of with both. They said that Mr. Smith owns the conversation, but the other stuff, the when he was calling, the where he was calling, how long he was calling, who he was calling, all this information was the property of the phone company. Basically, any information that was needed to, conduct business. In the case of modern day examples, that'd be, your search history or your email addresses, or maybe, your internet location, where you're hooking up from, that this information is actually the property of the provider. They need this information. And you may own the text message, but they own the information about the text message. So anything that basically bounces off this third party, and what I mean by that is like, I text, Mr. Field, but Verizon Wireless has to know, where is Mr. Field? Where am I? What's the number? How long did I text? How long was the text? That this information is the third party, and that this third party information is their property. And if they want to give it to the police, they can give it. This is known as metadata, and I need you to know that phrase. Metadata basically means that it's data about data. And so think of it this way: my text message is my data, but the length of my text message, the who of my text message, the when, the where was I, all this is the data about the data. Now, what all can we figure out with data about data? Well, we actually can figure out quite a bit. This is a map of connectivity created by Verizon customer users, or not Verizon, rather, but by Vodafone customer users in Germany. And you can see from the data, who's talking to who and who's talking the most. And we can figure out, where the people who are the most popular and influential live. And once we, start talking about, well, what cell tower was that person bouncing off of, and when does he do these things? And we collect all this data over a long period of time, we can figure out a lot of things like, where do you live? Where do the people who you're calling live? Where do you sleep at night? When do you wake up? What route do you take to work? And all this information, of course, would be very valuable, say, if you were a country like China that maybe wants to keep more tabs on their people. And so this data about data is very powerful. And in large quantities is probably can reveal a lot more than we would like it to think it does. Running out of time. It looks like we might have to have a fourth or a fifth video about the Fourth Amendment. So until then, stay healthy.